Okay, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. The presentation today is kind of Guatemala 101. For those of you who have been to the country and who know it well, some of you are from Guatemala or have lived in Guatemala many years, you'll probably find this fairly repetitive. But I hope those of you who have a lot of experience in Guatemala already will feel free to chime in and add material to what I'm saying or correct something that I might misspeak. And for those of you who are new to Guatemala, my hope is that you'll ask questions as we go along and feel free to interrupt. Just to give you a sense of what we're hoping to accomplish today, to understand Guatemalan philately, to understand Guatemalan stamps, you really have to understand Guatemalan history. And to understand Guatemalan postal history, you really have to understand Guatemalan geography and to some extent, its economic history. So I'm going to try to go through all of that very quickly, just in a very short presentation today, and hope that you'll feel free to answer questions. As you can see from this map, Guatemala is the northernmost of the Central American countries. It's about 800 miles from the Texas border, which means that the United States has had a connection with Guatemala ever since the two countries were independent. Guatemala has 18 million inhabitants now. About 42% of them are ethnically Maya, though that number changes. Everybody has a different estimate on that. Some people will say it's greater and others will say it's much lower. But when you travel to Guatemala, you realize that you're in the middle of a country that has a large ethnic group that speaks Mayan languages. It's roughly the size of Kentucky, and for much of its history, it has been a democracy not in the terms of an American democracy, but in terms of having the institutions that tend to characterize democratic nations. Some people will question their elections. There was an election held for president and for Congress just about a month ago, which is still being challenged and very much in the news for those of you who read Guatemalan news. You can see here that the Maya were the first major civilization to settle in Guatemala. The Olmecs settled in the south coast of Guatemala, so there is sort of a pre-Mayan period in Guatemala, but Guatemalan stamps have picked up on Mayan motifs ever since about 1918. I think the very first stamp that showed the monoliths of Quirigua appeared around 1918. And it was a time when American tourists started visiting Guatemala from the tour ships that would go up the Caribbean coast. And at that time, it was really just too laborious to get to Guatemala City, but tourists would take the train from Puerto Barrios to the Mayan ruins of Quirigua. And Quirigua, you can see here in the lower left is a souvenir sheet, which has some of the monoliths of Quirigua. And in the lower right, you see the same series of monoliths reflected in a 1942 series. The Maya ruled Guatemala from about, the classic period is from about 150 AD to 900 AD, though there are pre-classic sites that go as far back as 2000. There's a lot of controversy over why the Maya civilization came to an end, and we can talk about that at the end if there are people who are interested in hearing some of the different theories. But for philatelic purposes, you'll notice that certainly in recent years, there have been a lot more stamps heralding the Maya legacy of Guatemala. And in large part, it's to attract tourists. Tourism is a very important part of Guatemala's economy. And many of the tourists who come to Guatemala come looking for the Maya past. Tikal is probably the best known of the Mayan ruins. It's about an hour's flight north of Guatemala City. Today, it used to be when I was a kid living in Guatemala, you could fly in a DC-3 from Guatemala City right into Tikal, right into the ruin itself. Today, they fly jets, and it flies into Flores, which is the capital of Petén, and then you have to take a vehicle for about an hour through farmlands and then eventually the jungle to reach Tikal. It's a huge site, 25 square miles. Many of the temples were restored by the University of Pennsylvania back in the 1960s. It has a fascinating museum, which the stamps that you see here in the lower center, those are all pieces from the Salvinus G. Morley Museum in Tikal. Small museum, but absolutely breathtaking, some of the material that they have. This particular scene appeared in one of the Star Wars movie. For those of you who watched the Star Wars series, it took the roof combs of these temples. And for any of you who are planning on visiting Guatemala, I hope you will add Tikal to your visit. The Spanish arrived in 1519, and by 1521, 1522, they had largely subdued the post-classic Maya tribes of the highlands. In the classic period of the Maya history, almost all the cities were in the lowlands. They were in Petén, and they were in the Izabal. They were in the jungle area, what today are jungle areas. But after the collapse of the Maya Empire in 900, around between 800 and 900 AD, the Maya moved mostly up into the mountains, and that's where the Spanish found them in 1519. The conqueror of Guatemala is you can see him, Don Pedro de Alvarado, up in the upper left corner here. He is still celebrated in Guatemala, though now the Spanish conquest is being looked at a little bit differently than it was when this stamp was issued. In 1943, when they issued this stamp to commemorate the 400 years since the establishment of the city of Antigua, at that time, the Spanish conquest was viewed as a positive thing. Today, it's a lot more nuanced, and you find a lot more discussion in society about the value of preserving the original Maya practices and versus the advantages that were brought by the Spanish. In the middle, you see a stamp commemorating the University of San Carlos, which was the first university in Guatemala. It was the third university in Latin America, the first being in Mexico City, the second being in Lima, Peru, and this being the third university. So Antigua, Guatemala was really, of course, it wasn't called Antigua when it was built. It was just called the city of St. James of Guatemala, Santiago de Guatemala. But after an earthquake destroyed it in 1773, the capital was moved to Guatemala City, and the remaining city was called the Old Guatemala, or Antigua Guatemala. And you see here several stamps that are picturing the restored ruins of the colonial city of Guatemala. Those of you who have been to Guatemala as tourists have almost certainly been to Antigua. Antigua is probably the primary place that tourists visit in Guatemala. It's very close to Guatemala City. The weather's perfect all year round. It's never too hot. It's never too cold. And it's got these beautiful ruins all over that make you think you're in Rome or some other, ancient city. You see here a picture in the center and near the bottom of Rafael Landívar. He was one of the famous poets of Guatemala. There's a university that's named after him now, and he is buried in Antigua. There's a mausoleum to him in Antigua, and there's several stamps commemorating him. When you look at the stamps of Guatemala, particularly in the 1940s, there were a number of stamps heralding important Guatemalans from the colonial period. And several of them have stamps that were issued, commemorating them. Guatemalans today, many of them don't know them. Rafael Landívar, of course, is well known, but many of the poets that are pictured in the stamps of the 1940s are more obscure today. But fortunately, our handbooks give the story of who these individuals were, who shaped the history of Guatemala and its philately, because today they appear on quite a number of stamps. Here's a picture of Antigua, Guatemala. When I lived in Guatemala City, I rented an apartment in Antigua that I used on weekends. It's just a great place to escape to, lots of good restaurants, lots of music venues, and just, perfect climate all year round, much more relaxing than Guatemala City. On September 15th, 1821, Guatemala became independent of Spain. For a while, for 3 years, it was subsumed in the Mexican Empire. Mexico had also become independent, and the Emperor Iturbide had become the ruler, the de facto ruler of Guatemala. But Guatemala marks its independence. There are quite a number of stamps that celebrate Guatemala's independence from Spain, and that set off a series of events that went on for at least the next 50 years, where there were changes of power between different groups. There were attempts to get all of Central America together into one country. A lot of Americans look at Central America and wonder why there are 5 small independent countries. Why don't they get together and form just one bigger country? And there were certainly a number of attempts at that after 1821. A Honduran president named Francisco Morazan was probably the most successful, though his attempts to bring Central America together by force didn't last very long. Guatemalan presidents have also tried the same thing. Quite a number of Guatemalan presidents have seen themselves as potential presidents of all of Central America. So certainly the period between 1821 and about 1880, there were quite a number of attempts at bringing these countries together. In the early part of Guatemala's history, there was a fight between the conservatives and the liberals. And you find this throughout Latin America. Almost every Latin American country has had what they call a liberal revolution. And they all took place at different points in history. I served for 5 years in Ecuador. And Ecuador was one of the last countries to have a liberal revolution, which didn't succeed until the turn of the century. Here on the left, you see a picture of Rafael Carrera, souvenir sheet. Carrera was the last conservative president of Guatemala. He was pretty much a dictator, a military dictator. He came into power through armed means and restored what had been the power of different conservative groups in Guatemala. And when you look at liberal revolutions throughout Latin America, there are several things in common. One of the main purposes that the liberals had was to diminish the economic and political role of the Catholic Church. As you can imagine, the Catholic Church under under the Spanish colonial rule was quite important in almost every Latin American country, and certainly in Guatemala. After independence, the Catholic Church owned a lot of the property and had a lot of say in all of the political matters. And so conservatives were those who viewed the role of the Catholic Church and of the landed gentry, essentially the Guatemalan Creoles who had made a fortune under the Spanish crown. It defended their status and their property. Liberal revolutions, on the other hand, tried to introduce new ideas. And Guatemala's liberal revolution finally triumphed in 1871. You see on the right-hand side here, Justo Rufino Barrios. He was the military architect and the first liberal president of Guatemala. Garcia Granados, who had been a liberal president much earlier, not long after independence, was kind of the ideological creator of the liberal revolution. But finally, in 1871, the liberals prevailed. Justo Rufino Barrios marched from Quetzaltenango with troops on Guatemala City and seized it. And from then on, every government since 1871 has tried to identify itself in one way or another with the liberal revolution. Nobody wants to go back and identify themselves with the conservatives. And that's probably why when you look at Guatemalan stamps, you see lots of stamps commemorating the different liberal leaders. This is the only stamp, the sheet that you see on your left here, that commemorates any of the conservative leaders the country had. The conservative period ended in 1871, and people have not looked back on that era. So Justo Rufino Barrios, who you see here on the right, he brought in many reforms. He, in order to break the power of the Catholic Church, he took most of their property. One of their monasteries became the main post office in Guatemala City. So the post office that was destroyed in the earthquakes of 1917 and 1918, the post office that appears on the stamp of 1911, some of copies of which appeared with the post office upside down, that was actually a Franciscan monastery that was taken away from the church by Justo Rufino Barrios. I had long assumed that the introduction of postage stamps had been a liberal proposition, because the liberals were very progressive. They were trying to bring in all kinds of international ideas like greater trade, new products that could be produced in Guatemala. Their openness to the world had greatly exceeded what the conservatives had done. And since the first Guatemalan postage stamps appeared the same year as the liberal revolution, for many years I assumed that those were tied together. But in fact, it was the outgoing conservative government that ordered the stamps from Paris. And so it was, even though they were conservatives and were slow to move to the liberalizing policies that wound up marking Guatemala after the liberal revolution, they were in fact responsible for Guatemala's first postage stamps. You'll see several stamps throughout Guatemala, certainly after the centennial of the liberal revolution in 1871. Several stamps were issued that commemorate the liberal revolution. You see on the right, Miguel Garcia Granados, who was, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the intellectual architect of the liberal revolution, and Justo Rufino Barrios on the left, who was the military leader. The liberal revolution had a huge impact on philately, particularly on postal history, because it brought in a lot of foreigners. The conservatives had been hesitant to let foreigners move into the country, even though there were a few attempts during the conservative period. But after the liberals took over, they went out trying to recruit foreigners to come to Guatemala, to bring development, to bring their resources to develop the country. And the group that was perhaps most marked by this were the Germans. And so many Germans started coming to Guatemala after the liberal revolution. They planted coffee, they got involved in commerce, they built 2 different railroads. There were quite a number of developments that the Germans brought to parts of Guatemala that would never have happened without the liberal revolution. Also, Barrios brought in Protestant missionaries, in part mainly because he wanted to create a competition, for the Catholic Church. But one of the very first Protestant missionaries that came was Chauncey Hill, who also became a stamp dealer. And some of you have covers that were sent by Chauncey Hill to different stamp collectors around the world with his merchandise. And some of these covers are really quite unique. For instance, he had 4 of the 5 known covers with rail bond issues were sent by this Presbyterian missionary, Chauncey Hill. Cecile Gruson did some research on Chauncey Hill back, while she was still alive, and published in El Quetzal. And it really is kind of an interesting story. There is a book called Living in the New Jerusalem, which was written by Virginia Garrard Burnett, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And in her book, she describes how these early missionaries arrived. And Chauncey Hill, of course, is one of the more interesting ones, in part because he was the first, but in part because he also had lots of financial problems. And that's probably why he got into stamp dealing, because there just wasn't, the Presbyterian board in New York wasn't sending him enough money, to keep him and his ministry alive. He eventually got into some real estate deals that went south, and he had to leave the country. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is the large number of covers from very early issues of Guatemala that exist with Chauncey Hill written on the back. You'll also occasionally see covers from other countries to Chauncey Hill in Guatemala City, which are interesting because he used a number of different names, but always used his same last name. I noted here that the liberals brought in the railroad. You can see in the lower right corner of the stamp, the picture of the railroad crossing the Penitenciaria bridge. The railroads were perhaps one of the biggest inventions that were brought to Guatemala by the liberals, and really did have a transformation of Guatemala's economy. Between the liberal revolution of 1871 and the revolution of 1944, different liberal presidents ran the country. You had Estrada Cabrera, who was a dictator who ran the country for about 24 years or so, 25 years. You had Ubico, who was elected in the early 1930s, I think 1931, if I'm not mistaken. And while he was elected, most people believe he was elected honestly the first time. He got himself reelected 2 more times in questionable ways. And so he really ran the country as a dictator. But some of the most beautiful stamps of Guatemala were made during his presidency. For those of you who collect the airmail stamps of the early 1930s, some of those are designed by Jaime Marquardt's grandfather, if I remember correctly. They're some of the most beautiful stamps Guatemala has ever produced, and some of the ones that are most sought after. But his period of rule was really quite controversial. He was the middle class grew during his presidency simply because the economy grew, but he had not done an awful lot to alleviate poverty in the country. And by 1944, people were tired of him, and there was a progressive movement that threw him out. And so the revolution of 1944 is also sort of a major point in Guatemalan history that continues to be referred to today. And when you look at the stamps, there are quite a number of stamps commemorating the revolution in 1944. The one that you see here in the center, sort of center to the right of this screen, is one commemorating the first anniversary of the revolution, but there are stamps for the second anniversary and the 5th anniversary. And it's something, the revolution of 20th of October is still celebrated today in Guatemala. On the lower left, you have Juan Jose Arevalo, who came in as president in 1945. He was not part of the revolution. He was teaching at a university in Tucumán, Argentina, at the time of the revolution. But he was a Guatemalan academic, somebody who was well known in Guatemala. He wasn't a politician, but he was recruited by the army officers who had overthrown Ubico to come back and run for president. And most of the opposition parties gathered around him. They created a front. So he won overwhelmingly in the election of 1945. And Arevalo brought in a lot of progressive changes. For instance, he brought in labor laws, which allowed people to form labor unions and strike. And that was such a major issue for Guatemala that he issued a postage stamp, a series of 4 postage stamps, to commemorate that labor law. He also created the Social Security Institute, which for the first time had created public pensions and created a public health system for workers, which was totally unknown before 1945. So Arevalo is looked at as one of the major reformers, product of the 1944 revolution. Interestingly, one of his sons ran for president of Guatemala 6 weeks ago and won. And so the next president of Guatemala will be a son of Juan Jose Arevalo, assuming that the current controversies that are racking the election are able to be resolved. But the 1944 revolution led to a series of other events and a counter-revolution in 1954, 10 years later. So after Arevalo finished his term, another army officer named Jacobo Arbenz won the election and became president and continued the reforms of his predecessor, Arevalo, and also took on the United Fruit Company. And Arabenz's view was that the United Fruit Company had too great an influence over Guatemala, both through its economic weight, but also for the influence that it had in politics, really since the early 1900s. And so he was determined to whittle down the influence of the United Fruit Company. He had a number of communist advisors in his government, mostly brought in from Spain and from Chile and other places, Mexico. He himself, I don't think anybody has accused him of being a communist, but certainly he had a lot of communists in his government, and that scared the United States. It scared the Catholic Church in Guatemala. It scared the business community in Guatemala. And so there was a movement to throw him out in 1954. And the CIA got behind that movement, and effectively Arbenz was removed from power. And the experience of reform, which had begun in 1944, pretty much came to an end in 1954. Here on the left, you see the symbol of what they called the Liberation Army, and that was the movement to remove Arbenz and to remove the communist advisors who he had brought in. And on the right, you see a picture of Carlos Castillo Armas, who was the military officer, a former military officer, who the CIA supported in his quest to remove Arbenz. And in the middle of it, you see the latest book to have been printed about the 1954 revolution, which you can find on Amazon, written by yours truly. It focuses on the role of the United States Congress and the press in the United States and how they influenced events that eventually led to the removal of Jacobo Arbenz. But that's a period of Guatemala's history that's still very much debated. Guatemalans are very divided on the issue of whether Arbenz was a positive force or a negative force. But when you look at Guatemalan philately, you'll see quite a number of stamps. These are the airmail stamps that you see here, but there are also regular mail stamps commemorating the end or the liberation fight, which wound up getting rid of Arbenz in 1954. When you go back through the postage stamps of the Arbenz and the Arevalo era, you note that they really focus on social justice and sort of the policies and institutions that were created by these two men. It's an interesting philatelic history, and also there are a lot of covers that address the individuals, the players. It's easy to find covers, from the 1950s, which were either written to or written by players in the 1954 revolution. And I find that to be an interesting subject to get into philatelically. And it's also a pretty cheap one because most of these covers sell for $1 or $2. The stamps are not terribly rare. But that's a period in Guatemala's history that's very much involved with Guatemalan philately. It's hard to understand Guatemala without looking at sort of its economic development. When the Spanish took over Guatemala, at first their main products were for local consumption. They really weren't for export. The Spanish had hoped to find a lot of gold and silver, which they didn't find much of in Guatemala. There is some gold and silver in Guatemala, but not a great deal. Eventually, the Spanish got into producing cochineal, which is a carmine dye, a red dye that was used for textiles back in Spain. And so Guatemala's biggest export during the colonial period was this carmine dye. Unfortunately for Guatemala, by the early 1800s, Europe was already developing synthetic dyes. And so the demand for cochineal dropped drastically. And that was probably one of the reasons why it was easier to bring about independence, because the economy of Guatemala was beginning to suffer from the loss of this export income. And so that put a lot of pressure on the Spaniards that were running the country, who could no longer provide the type of economic benefits that they could in an earlier period. With the liberal revolution, Justo Rufino Barrios brought in, as I mentioned earlier, a bunch of Germans and some Americans to try to develop the country. And the Germans started taking advantage of a new product that had just been planted in Guatemala around the 1850s, and that was coffee. And the Germans realized that Guatemalan coffee was really some of the best that ever had. And so they started producing it in large quantities. They started turning over big sections of the jungle and turning them into coffee producing areas, and wound up becoming very rich. And today you'll find many, many covers written by or to German coffee producers, particularly in Alta Verapaz, which is in north central Guatemala, and in an area that they call the Boca Costa, which is kind of the Piedmont, where the mountains hit the Pacific coastal plain in southwestern Guatemala. And so there are quite a number of covers. I'm sure most of you who collect Guatemalan postal history have covers written to or from these Germans who developed the coffee industry. The United Fruit Company was brought into Guatemala by President Estrada Cabrera at the turn of the century, and they started planting bananas first on the Atlantic coast and eventually on the Pacific coastal plain of Guatemala. And that became a big part of Guatemala's economy, never quite as large as coffee, more controversial because it was almost entirely in the hands of foreigners. But bananas became a big part of the economy between 1905 and the 1954 revolution. After the government of Arbenz expropriated a lot of the land of the United Fruit Company in 1952 and 1953, and then after United Fruit had not an anti-dumping suit, it was a suit by the Justice Department against the company for monopolizing the banana trade. Bananas became much less important in Guatemala's economy. And they still export bananas from Guatemala, but it's no longer a major part of the economy. In the 1920s, Estrada Cabrera began trying to bring tourists to the country. He used stamps as a way to help influence them. The 1902 Waterloo stamps were in part designed to highlight the development of Guatemala. You see the public buildings and the monuments, on those stamps, but they also were part of a propaganda campaign to bring tourists to Guatemala. Tourism really became a major part of Guatemala's economy by the 1960s and 1970s. By the early 80s, tourism started flagging because of the political problems the country was having. There was an internal conflict that went on from 1960 to 1996, which discouraged a lot of tourism. Tourism is back now, but it's no longer the main driver of the Guatemalan economy. What has become the main driver of the Guatemalan economy is remittances from Guatemalans living outside of Guatemala, largely in the United States. This year, or I'm sorry, in 2022, the amount of remittances sent by Guatemalans in the United States to Guatemala was $18 billion. All of Guatemala's exports, sugar, coffee, bananas, gold, everything that Guatemala exported in that year only amounted to $16.5 billion. So you can see how remittances from Guatemalans in the diaspora have really become the main focus of Guatemalan foreign exchange, which has kept the Guatemalan quetzal very strong for many years. It hasn't devalued in many, many years. But remittances continue to play a really defining role in Guatemala's economy. You see here on the right side stamps commemorating the coffee industry, and down below commemorating the tourism industry, both of which continue to be very important to Guatemalans today. When you look at Guatemala's geography, you essentially see three different zones, and this map makes them pretty clear. In the north, you have the Petén, which when I was a child, that was all jungle. You know, lots of Mayan ruins lost in the jungle there. Now a lot of the jungle has been cut down and it's been turned into cattle land, and other farming, you know, goes on in that area. But the north of Guatemala is relatively uninhabited compared to the rest of the country. On the south coast, the Pacific coast, you see that green stretch, and that area is very productive and has been productive for a couple of centuries. There's a lot of sugar farming there. There used to be cotton. There's not as much cotton anymore. There's some bananas being planted there, but sugar has pretty much taken over the Pacific coast in the last few years. Then you see that stretch in the middle, which is brown, and that's really where most Guatemalans have always lived. So you have Guatemala City in the middle of that, and that's a stretch of mountains that is, it's on average about 5,000 feet elevation. So it's always cool, but never cold. It doesn't snow in Guatemala, but in the highlands, it never gets terribly hot either. And so you have on to the west of Guatemala City, that area is almost entirely Maya. There are a number of different Mayan tribes or Mayan language groups, which you would find in those mountains west of Guatemala City. To the east of Guatemala City, it's largely Spanish speaking, and those areas are drier. They have a different kind of agriculture, a different kind of, the population is really quite different. And so to understand the postal history of Guatemala, most of the covers that you will see, the common covers, are either out of Guatemala City or Quetzaltenango, which is the city that you see, the second largest city in Guatemala, which is in the far west of the country, or they're from the German coffee areas, which are just south of Quetzaltenango. You have quite a number of covers that come from San Sebastián, La Violeta, Mazatenango, Retauleo, all of those cities where the Germans had farms, or they come from north central Guatemala. It's kind of hard to see because the letters are pretty small, but there's an area called Alta Verapaz, which you can see almost in the very center of this map. And that is an area where many Germans settled. In fact, Germans pretty much controlled the entire economy of Alta Verapaz for, close to 150 years, until World War II, when many of their properties were seized by the Ubico administration. There's what they call the picket fence of volcanoes that separate the highlands from the Pacific coastal plain. And these really are the same chain of volcanoes that start in Alaska and end down in Chile. So it's a series, sort of a volcanic fault line that separates the highlands from the lowlands. And Rod Henney did an excellent job a couple of months ago talking about the role of volcanoes in Guatemala and philately. But volcanoes are a permanent presence in Guatemala. No matter where you are, you can generally see volcanoes. And they form the line that separates the culture, their cultural separations, economic separations between the highlands and the lowlands. And the volcanoes are kind of the reminder of that difference. They're also just amazingly beautiful. So when you're looking at your postal history, the big question is, so what are all of these places? David Reitzema, in the last issue of El Quetzal, had an article about a cover carried by a flight from Guatemala City to Flores. You see Flores up in the north of the screen, right at the kind of at the top, right at the base of this little lake. Back when that cover was sent, there were no roads at all between Guatemala City and Flores. There were trails, but these weren't trails that a cart could go on. These were only trails that a horse could go on. And so when flights first started going into Flores in the 1920s, this really was a major development, for that town, and eventually led to the economic development of the whole Petén area. But when you're looking at your covers, they often conceal a history of Guatemala's development that is really quite interesting. And here you can see that there are areas where covers are very rare. For instance, Santa Cruz del Quiché, which you see a little bit on to the west of Guatemala, to the west of Coban and the west of Guatemala City, sort of northwest of Guatemala City. That area, it's very, very rare to find a cover from Santa Cruz del Quiché. Now, it's a fairly large town. It's the capital of the province of El Quiché, but it's an area that had very few foreigners. You didn't have French or you didn't have German merchants there. You didn't even really have many American missionaries in Santa Cruz del Quiché. And so there was no real reason for there to be a lot of correspondence from Quiché. And so when you look at this map, there are a number of areas that some of you will recognize as being on your covers because they're towns that had a large foreign population. But many of these areas of Guatemala really are quite remote. And even those that aren't terribly remote, they may not have an awful lot of letters originating there. So with that, I'd like to bring the presentation to a close and ask what questions you might have.
Okay, let me make sure that everyone is unmuted. I muted almost everyone. So I'm going to remove the spotlight from you so we can see each other. All right, and if you have a question, please do make sure to unmute yourself. Okay, please feel free to address David.
This is Richard. I just want to make a comment, David, about your, you mentioned your new book. I want to tell everybody else I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's a really good read. And no, David didn't pay me to say that, but it's a great book. So if you get a chance to get it on Amazon, I recommend it. I've really been enjoying it.
Thanks, Richard. I need all the help I can get.
David, I think that was the most fantastic telling of history in the time you had. And I think that your talk is going to be a very important one for our organization.
I hope it'll make people more interested in postal history because the postal history really is quite fascinating. And you can buy a cover for $1.25 that may have an incredible amount of history behind it.
It's made me realize how little I know.
I have to say, after having edited the handbook and go through all the stamps and all the history and everything, this really tied it in. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Any questions, please feel free. Bill, if you're speaking, you're muted. Bill, you're still muted. Bill, Bill Wojtowicz, looks like you're trying to say something, but you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Am I okay now?
Yes, you are, Bill. Thank you.
Okay. I have been working on a project on Guatemalan history, but in regards to only one very short period of time that I found to be the most fascinating and probably one of the most important periods of time in Guatemalan history, and that is with the Central American Exposition of 1897. Because that basically killed the economy of Guatemala because of the extravagance of that particular project and how it failed by getting support either from the world, other Central American countries, and the fact that that was a period of time that coffee collapsed in the country, along with the price of silver. And it also led to the president's assassination, or would say murder, from the British merchant the following year. And I really find that interesting because the stamps of that series, along with its postal stationery, was absolutely extravagant in values, that is, face values of the stamps, compared to many things. And I find that very interesting, and I'm highlighting this in Arizona's big exhibition that will be in 2024 in February, because I'm planning to the first time show an exhibit from Guatemala, but it's of that particular period of time, the stationery, the stories of the people involved, the story of the British battleship or warship that was in port for the fair, along with those things, and the fact that Costa Rica was the only Central American country who really did any type of support. But I find that to be very interesting, and if you have any more information about that, if that could somehow be sent to me, because I'm acquiring everything to put together this exhibit. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that that you put your finger on something very important, and that President Reina Barrios, who was the president who launched that exhibition, he had spent a lot of time in Paris, and so he had essentially fallen in love, with France.
Architecture.
Yeah, and he decided that he was going to bring to Guatemala, he was going to turn Guatemala into Paris, and he's a nephew of President Justo Rufino Barrios. And so he'd sort of risen, he was, part of Guatemala's political and economic elite. And I'm going to make a mistake here, but I believe his wife was either French or Spanish. I think he got married when he was in Europe. And so he was determined to Europeanize Guatemala. And he saw this exposition as a chance to do that. And he also saw the exposition as a chance to expand Guatemala's claim to rule all of Central America. He never launched an army to consolidate Central America, but he clearly viewed the exposition as a chance to make that case. And then, of course, when he was killed, that opened the door for Estrada Cabrera to become president. Estrada Cabrera was they didn't have vice presidents at the time. They had it had a different title, but in essence, it was the person who would become the president. Estrada Cabrera was not a leading politician. He was not someone who was seen to be as a power. But when he all of a sudden inherited the presidency sort of unexpectedly, he made the most of it, and he ruled the country for 25 years with an iron fist. So I think that you're right that the Central American Exposition did have a huge impact on Guatemalan politics. It eventually, as they led to the rise of Estrada Cabrera, it broke the bank.
Right.
If you collect Guatemalan coins, you notice that after 1897, the coins were all nickel instead of being
Silver.
Because the country just didn't have any money. you know,
Mhm.
for that. So it was quite an interesting period, one that most Guatemalans don't focus on today. It's not something, I mean, today's legacy of that exhibition is the Boulevard La Reforma, which was built by Reina Barrios to look like the Champs-Élysées. And it's
Right.
a beautiful boulevard today with lots of monuments and trees. Beautiful. Most of the buildings that he built for the exposition collapsed in the earthquake of 1917, 1918.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
Most of them are now gone.
David,
David,
do you know, excuse me, do you know if wasn't there some sort of uprising in Quetzaltenango in 1897 also that interrupted mail to and from that city? Are you familiar with that?
There may have been. I don't have my dates for the uprisings in Quetzaltenango. There were two different periods in which Quetzaltenango became independent of Guatemala. They called themselves the República de los Altos. And I don't know the dates for those. One of them could have been in 1897. I just don't remember.
Wasn't there something around 1821? I know looking at Papel Sellado, the Los Altos had their own revenue paper at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was always a separate province, but part of Guatemala. But there were two different periods, one of which lasted less than a year. And the other one, I don't recall how long it lasted, but it wasn't very long, maybe maybe 3 years, in which Los Altos was no longer just a separate province, but it was no longer part of Guatemala. But that was repressed both times. You know, the army marched from Guatemala City and eventually subjected them to Guatemalan sovereignty.
So when are we going? ISPC should go.
Hey, Bill, are you going to submit an article to El Quetzal, I hope, when you're done with your
Well,
research?
I have been doing several articles for various journals in our area of the Southwest. And I have been doing all of them on the situation of 1897, especially concerning the railroad that never got built, that the president wanted built to really help bring in the imports and send out the exports that he helped to do. But it was, of course, 1906 before the railroad got completed.
Well, I know you're publishing these in regional publications.
Right.
If you could send copies to Rod Haney and a release to allow us to reprint some of that in El Quetzal. Also, as you know, Bill, we have a new handbook, and I would love to expand the section on the 1897 exhibition with some of the information that you're discovering.
One thing about that, the stamps that were issued for that particular period, of which was a set of about 12 stamps, along with a tremendous amount of postal stationery. But I have lots of the stationery, both mint and used and everything else. But the stamps are hard to find used, and it is a rarity to find any of those on cover. Because
yes,
why should they?
Except the lower values.
Yeah, few of the lower values. So really, to me, it was a section of stamps that really did not serve much of a purpose.
Highly speculative, like the U.S. Columbian series.
Well, the Columbian, at least it had more than 40,000 people to show up during a 6-month period. And that was another thing. The show was a complete failure when it came to attendance. Nobody could afford the money to go to it locally, and with the railroad not built, and the fact that the advertising for the show really didn't get around the world very much, with the exception of delegation from Costa Rica, of which my family is from. They were basically the only one in Central America and Latin America that participated in the fair.
I had a quick question for David. Would it be fair to say that President Ovico did a significant amount of the expansion of the postal system and sort of modernizing it and expanding it? as part of his public works campaign?
I would have to say that I don't really know what he did in terms of modernizing the postal system, but two of the things that he did that had a direct impact on the postal system were he built a lot of roads. And so those roads enabled mail to be carried much more quickly. The other thing he did is he finished building the post office, which had been destroyed since 1918 and hadn't been finished. And so he eventually finished that. So those were two areas where I guess there'd be a third area, you could say, in that he created the motorcycle service to Alta Verapaz and Baja Verapaz. He had been governor of Alta Verapaz back in the 1920s. And I'm sure he suffered having to go to Guatemala City, through these mule cart roads, forever and ever and ever. And it probably took him weeks to get mail, from the outside. And so once he became president, one of the first things he did was he created a motorcycle postal service to the two Verapazes. How consequential was that in the long run? Probably not terribly, because not long after that, roads were built, and by 1944, 1945, the motorcycles were no longer necessary for for carrying the mail. But his expansion of the road system definitely had an impact on expanding the mail. I don't know if many more post offices were opened during his reign. I've never kind of looked at that element of it, but his modernization of transportation clearly had a huge impact.
Okay, thanks, David.
Okay, it looks like we're coming to the end of our hour. I try to keep this within the time bounds. Again, David, thank you so much. I appreciate all the folks who showed up today, and very, very heartening. I think we had something like 27 people sign up, 20 people were here. I thank you all. Dave, any final comments?
Just to encourage all of you to visit Guatemala at some time. If you collect Guatemalan stamps and like Guatemalan philately and postal history, definitely go see the country. It'll make you much more impassioned